Welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm Catherine Allgore, president of the MHS, and welcome to what promises to be a great program. Our moderator, Ted Widmer, will formally introduce our presenters, but let me add that I'm personally thrilled to be in a room with them because I have strong personal and intellectual connections with this group of colleagues. And speaking of connections, except for our moderator, all the panelists share connections with the University of Virginia. That is particularly fitting for an MHS event. In addition to being the home of the Adams Family Papers, we also hold an enormous collection of Thomas Jefferson's personal papers. I'd like to think that John Adams and Mr. Jefferson are looking down on us today with approbation. But before we get started, I'd like to address the reason that we are here on this particular day. This program was originally scheduled for last Wednesday, and obviously we had to postpone. Like all of us, the staff of the Massachusetts Historical Society are reeling, shaken, horrified, and angered at the assault on our capital and our democracy. As an institution, we are thinking through how we can respond usefully, what role we can play in enriching a public conversation that moves the nation toward reckoning, justice, and then unity. Because that is one thing we are sure of, we do have a role to play. As the collectors and preservers of historical documents, as an educational center committed to sharing our collections and the lessons of history to as many people as possible, the Historical Society is ready to help our nation move forward. Thank you for being part of us. Now, let's get the conversation going. Gavin, will you introduce our speakers?
And I'd like to extend a welcome to everyone who's joining us. My name is Gavin Cleespies. I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is a remarkably popular program. We have close to 400 people joining us. So based on the popularity of this program, I'm going to guess that some people may be joining us for the first time. If you are, I'd like to extend a special welcome to you. If you're not familiar with the Massachusetts Historical Society, we are the oldest historical society in America. We were founded in 1791 and have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 229 years. We are now, in these days of social distancing, hosting virtual programs, and we have an exciting schedule of programs in store. If you are interested in learning about them, you can visit our website, masshist.org, to learn all about them. We have a great program today with a great panel. I'm going to begin just by introducing our moderator, and then he's going to introduce the other speakers individually. When we were planning this program a couple of months ago, we really thought, you know, we're just gonna miss the moment, and we're waiting until January. It's going to be too late. I think that I can speak with confidence and say that we have not missed the moment. This is still a very relevant conversation. So without further ado, our moderator is Professor Edward Widmer, or as he is known at MHS, Ted Widmer. He is a longtime friend to MHS, serving as a trustee and the chair of our program committee, and also the chair of our Digital Initiatives Committee. He received his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate from Harvard University, where he was also appointed a lecturer on history and literature from 1993 until 1997. From 1997 to 2001, he worked in the White House as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton, as a foreign policy speechwriter and senior advisor for special projects, which involved advising on history and scholarship-related issues, while the former president was writing his autobiography. He was the first director of the CV Star Center for the Study of American Experience from 2001 to 2006, and an associate professor of history at Washington College from 2001. In 2006, he was appointed the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, where he led efforts to digitize the library's holdings. From 2012 to 2013, he was a senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and between 2010 and 2015, he helped to create and often contributed to the New York Times Disunion, a digital history of the Civil War. Mr. Professor Widmer is remarkably qualified to moderate our program this evening with firsthand experience of politics, as well as a great knowledge of American history. He is currently a professor at the Macaulay Honors College in New York. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Widmer to lead us through the program.
Thank you so much, Gavin and Catherine and Sarah Bertulli, who also helped set up this program. And as Gavin said, our timing couldn't be better. And I'm already grateful to the MHS and to our panelists for giving me a chance to talk and even better to listen, to try to sort through the very confusing events of this week in which we saw things that we have never seen in our history. And we have a blue chip panel of historians to help us sort through in order of the chronology through which with which we will address disputed presidential elections of the past. We have Peter Onuf of the University of Virginia, a very distinguished historian of Thomas Jefferson and his world, the author of more than a dozen books about Jefferson, most recent of which was Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, which he co-wrote with Annette Gordon-Reed. Joanne Freeman of Yale University will help us sort through the difficult elections of the early republic, especially the election of 1824. She too is the author of many books. She edited the Library of America book of the writings of Alexander Hamilton and Affairs of Honor, and most recently Field of Blood. And then Rachel Shelden of Pennsylvania State University and Erik Alexander of Southern Illinois University will help us think about 1860 and 1876. I too have been writing about 1860 in recent weeks, and I have a book out about Lincoln's very difficult train trip into Washington after winning the 1860 election. And only yesterday, time is going by so quickly I can barely remember, but I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about a near riot that took place in the Capitol in February 1861 on the same day that Congress met to count the electoral certificates, much like what Wednesday was. And Rachel is the author of a recent book called Washington Brotherhood about popular sovereignty and the coming of the Civil War. Erik is finishing a book called Revolution Forestalled about Northern Democrats in the 1870s. So we're so lucky to have them. And we're so lucky to all be here at the invitation of the MHS, which among many other things is a presidential library. It holds the papers of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams. So those are three presidents right there. In my own research on 1860 and 61, I found the diaries of Charles Francis Adams Sr. and his two sons, Charles Francis Adams Jr. and Henry Adams, to be incredibly valuable. They were in Washington at another very roiled moment as the country was not entirely sure if a newly elected president would make it to Washington. So thank you, MHS. Thank you all for coming in such large numbers. And we really want to hear from you too. So after we historians have talked for a little bit, we're going to open it up to Q&A from everybody. So we might as well start at the beginning. And Peter, thank you for joining us. The election of 1800, we often, those of us who study history, remember Jefferson's words about all being Federalists, all being Republicans, but it was a contested election. Can you tell us what was so difficult about the election of 1800?
Everything, Ted, everything was difficult. And I think a good place to begin is with the idea of what was it? How did people experience it? And if you use that trendy expression now of real time, things were happening in real time the other day. I don't want to talk about recent events, of course. Well, what would real time be in 1800? And then in 1801, which is when the rubber hits the road, real time is local time. There's no mediation. We're not all on social media. And so we now campaign forever, they voted forever. So the election of 1800 took many months, and it took place in the various states. And another thing I'd like to point out is the Electoral College was not controversial because it was part of the grand bargain, which was the federal Constitution. And if you believed in anything that would hold the country together, it was the Constitution and the more perfect union it supposedly created. That's an interesting change from then to now. The idea of one person, one vote, no, forget it. We're talking about sustaining a federal republic of semi-sovereign autonomous states, and that federal republic was always in the early period on the verge of collapse. So the short answer to your question, everything is at stake because nobody knows if this experiment in Republican government is going to succeed. And I'd like to add one more thing, and that is if union is all important, it's all important not just because, oh, we have to find a way to compromise these difficult issues of slavery and trade and immigration and naturalization. Well, this all is taking place. This election is taking place in a world at war, in a world in which the United States, the barely United States, are in a state of existential risk. And so the divisions we have among Americans between we are all Federalists, we're all Republicans, well, we're all at each other's throats because we don't know what the future holds. And Americans, if there's mediation in 1800 and 1801, it's through the lenses of the French Revolution. It's with the idea that the future of mankind is at stake because of fundamental division between those who support a traditional old regime hierarchy and those who favor popular sovereignty and self-government. Now, we take that for granted, or we did until this week, self-government, Republican self-government, but it's the last thing you could take for granted in 1801.
Thank you so much, Peter. Joanne, we're so lucky to have you. Thank you for joining us today. And your work really illuminates the current moment because you have brilliantly shown in your books how close to the surface of politics was violence, physical intimidation or real violence. So I'm sure we're going to want to get to that. But at the MHS, we always like to come back to the Adamses. And just as John Adams was in the election of 1800 that Peter just told us about, John Quincy Adams is in 1824. Can you just walk us through the basic events of 1824?
Sure. At the time, I suppose it's not going to surprise anyone here to learn that moments of fraught politics produce fraught elections. So that was true. Certainly, Peter just described 1800. In 1824, you had recently had an economic crisis, a panic. Slavery was a crisis throughout this period, but 4 years back, you had had a compromise worked out, and forging a compromise does not usually leave people feeling very comfortable about the thing that was just compromised. So you get to 1824, and with all of that angst, you also have essentially one party that's dominating the national government, the Democratic Republican Party. So what happens in that election is that party, not unified, but actually splintering, the different splinters of that party put up different candidates. You end up getting really 4 main candidates running for president in that election. And that includes, as Ted mentioned a moment ago, John Quincy Adams is one, Andrew Jackson is one, Henry Clay is one, and William Crawford, who nobody knows about, was the other. So they run for office. Andrew Jackson actually wins the electoral unpopular vote, but by a plurality and not by an absolute majority. So what happens, and it's only happened, I think, 3 times in American history, and 1800 was one of those instances, 1876 is the other, is that the election has to be thrown to the House as determined by the Constitution into a contingent election to decide the election. Now, according to the rules, that election, the House is deciding between the top 3 candidates. Henry Clay gets tossed because he was not one of the top 3 candidates. So the House now has to figure out which of those candidates is going to win the presidency. Each state has 1 vote. They vote as a block. At the time, there were 24 states. And I believe you had to get 13 states to win the presidency. So they begin debating. Henry Clay, who is no longer a candidate, he really, really, really hated Andrew Jackson. His policies were closer to Adams's. So what Henry Clay does is basically try to push people towards supporting John Quincy Adams so that he can win that election. And John Quincy Adams does indeed win that election. After Adams becomes president, he then makes Clay his Secretary of State. And this is the part of this election that has echoes to the current moment. So immediately people start talking about, it's the equivalent of fraud, voting fraud. They talk about a corrupt bargain, right? There was a corrupt bargain that, Clay basically said, make me Secretary of State and I'll get you made president. And despite the fact that, there's not necessarily evident of a corrupt bargain, that those kinds of charges, as we're seeing all too well, really have power, right? You corrupted the system. So that's part of the legacy of that election, is this corrupt bargain idea, which Andrew Jackson and his supporters really bank on for the next 4 years. And in 1828, it helps raise Jackson to the presidency.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Rachel, I don't think any election has resurfaced as much as 1860 over the last year, sometimes with dread and other times people just celebrating it. You see bumper stickers or there were t-shirts a couple days ago, Civil War 2.0. And of course, the photograph of the Confederate flag being paraded in the Capitol. So I'm sure we're going to want to talk about 1860, and we'll get into the details later, but can you just tell us, who are the candidates? What are the issues? Was it as divisive as 1824 and 1800, or was it actually a reasonably conclusive result, despite the fact there were surging emotions underneath the actual voting?
Yeah, so that's sort of the most interesting part about 1860. All of these other elections, you might say, have some element of contestation in the election itself, but 1860 was a pretty straightforward election. There were also 4 candidates in 1860, although again, that was not totally uncommon. You had 4 different candidates. You had Abraham Lincoln from the Republican Party. You have 2 different Democrats. You have Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. Douglas representing sort of the northern wing of the Democratic Party, and Breckinridge representing the southern wing of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had met in Charleston earlier in 1860 and tried to come together on a candidate and a platform, but Southern Democrats walked out of that convention, and as a result, they ended up splintering, and you end up with 2 different candidates. And then the final candidate was John Bell, who represented the Constitutional Union Party, which is also a party we don't really know much about or think much about now. Interestingly, as a tie to the Massachusetts Historical Society, his running mate was Edward Everett, whose diaries and papers are at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And Everett, we like as historians because he has some of the best handwriting of any of the folks who lived in the 19th century. So, the election moves in a pretty standard fashion. One important thing to recognize about 19th century voting is that there was no standard ballot. So in each individual state, the way that people voted is that they brought a party ticket with them to the polls. So they would cut it out of the newspaper. Republican newspapers would print party tickets. Democratic newspapers would print party tickets. You didn't go to an election place and fill out a ballot like you do now in what we call the Australian ballot. So this is what happened. This is what took place across the country. In northern states, you had Republicans bringing those Republican Party tickets to vote for Lincoln. Lincoln ends up winning most northern states and the West, California and Oregon, although those more because the Democrats split. Lincoln wins the second lowest percentage of the popular vote after 1824. He wins less than 40% of the popular vote, but he wins 180 electoral votes, which is quite a bit more than he needed. He needed 152 at that time. So probably not likely that the Democrats could have won, even if they were united. But the election goes through pretty easily. There's not any more fraud or corruption than there typically is in the 19th century, the voting experience being what it is at that time. But it's the reaction to Lincoln actually being elected that I think people are drawing comparisons to. So Lincoln is elected. The folks who are in the Democratic Party accept that Lincoln has been elected, but they do not like the consequences of that. And so shortly after his election, we get the secession of South Carolina, December 20th, 1860, and then other states to follow.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And I want to thank you and Erik, our next historian, for writing so well and so quickly rapid fire op-eds in real time. And this week on Wednesday morning, before the riot, still looking for the right word to use, insurrection, invasion, desecration of the Capitol. Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, went into a fair amount of detail about the election of 1876, arguing that Congress should create a commission like it did in 1876 to send the vote back to the states. And immediately you and Erik responded in a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post. So turning it over to you, Erik, 1876 is coming up fast as an election we all need to know about again. Pretty similar in some ways to 2020, different in others. Can you walk us through it?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just echo what others have said. I'm really excited to be a part of this. And I'm glad we have the opportunity to help put, I think, what's been a really stressful few months in some historical context. And thanks for mentioning that op-ed. And I think 1876 might be the closest parallel. There are some remarkable similarities between what happened in 1876 and 2020. But there's also some really important differences, which we can talk about. It was an extraordinarily complicated election. I think it's probably an election that most Americans are not particularly familiar with, though I think it's, as you mentioned, Ted, it's coming up more and more. And for those Americans who are familiar with it, they've probably heard kind of a condensed version that might not always be entirely accurate. So I'll try to summarize as briefly as possible. Bear with me, because again, it's incredibly complicated. One of the main things I think to understand about the context for 1876 is that this is really the first election after the Civil War where both of the major political parties were at full strength. And of the four elections we're talking about, this is actually the first one in the 19th century, or the first one of these four that actually featured both Republicans and Democrats, strictly Republicans and Democrats like we have today. And in 1876, particularly in the South, there were large numbers of white Southern Democrats. These are former Confederates. And they're coming back to vote for the first time since the Civil War. And there's also large numbers of Black men, also in the South. Some of them who also are voting for the very first time, and they're voting Republican. So the result is you get this really partisan and polarized atmosphere, and also an incredibly high level of voter turnout. 1876 remains the highest turnout in American history of eligible voters at 81.8%. Of course, because this is the 19th century, women still cannot vote in most of the country. And by comparison, we don't have official numbers yet, but I think most estimates put 2020 somewhere around 65 to 70% of turnout. So you have this incredibly polarized, hyper-partisan atmosphere. The Democratic candidate was a man named Samuel J. Tilden. He was the governor of New York. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio, and a former Union general. And immediately after the election on November 7th, most observers thought Tilden had won. Hayes even wrote in his diary on election night that he believed Tilden had won. And it was clear that Tilden had at least 184 of the required 185 electoral votes that were needed for a majority. Hayes had 164, but there were three southern states, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where the vote was contested. And in the weeks after the election, it became clear very quickly there were rampant problems with fraud and especially voter suppression, and probably more so than was common in most 19th century elections. So, for example, in one of the contested states of South Carolina, voter turnout was a mathematically impossible 101%. So clearly there was fraud, but there was also this horrific campaign of voter suppression across the South, and particularly in states that had these disputed votes, where white Southern Democrats used extra military groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others, and they used violence, intimidation to prevent Black men from voting. Like today, the electoral votes of individual states were certified at the state level. They used canvassing boards, and then state governors certified. Those were controlled by political parties. And what happened in 1876 is that each political party effectively certified its own result in the contested states. So the outcome was that each of these three contested states sent 2 sets of electoral votes to Congress for certification. And let me be clear, this is very different than what we just saw in 2020, because even though this past election, there were frivolous, unsuccessful, and frankly illegitimate lawsuits that challenged the vote, but none of the outcomes in the states this past year, were legitimately in dispute. Every state sent a very clear and uncontested result to Congress. But in 1876, 3 different states sent 2 sets of certificates to Congress and effectively told Congress, you decide, you figure it out. And unlike 2020, the only thing governing the process in 1876 was the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which had been ratified effectively in response to what took place in 1800. And the 12th Amendment isn't particularly specific. There's nothing about how to handle contested votes. And it just says that sort of once Congress gets the votes, they count them, but it doesn't really say who and how. So this is really an unprecedented crisis. It's exacerbated by the fact that this is only 12 years after the Civil War. There's sectional tensions, polarization remain really high. And there's a lot at stake, including not only the return of former Confederates to the polls, but really big questions about what the United States was going to look like, questions about the rights and citizenship of African Americans in the South, and frankly, questions we're still grappling with today. The solution that Rachel and I wrote about, and Ted Cruz talked about in the joint session on Wednesday, this was a bipartisan electoral commission. There are some really complicated reasons why this commission was necessary, which I won't get into, but it was made up of 5 members of the Democratic House, 5 members of the Republican Senate, and 5 Supreme Court justices. Congress chose 4 of the Supreme Court justices, including 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and then those 4 justices would pick the final member. And most assumed that final member was going to be a justice named David Davis of Illinois. He was an independent. Many thought he might favor Tilden. At the last minute, though, Davis actually resigned from the Supreme Court because he was elected to the Senate by Illinois. In his place, the final commission member was a Republican justice named Joseph R. Bradley. The commission listened to arguments in February of 1877. In the 19th century, inaugurations took place in March, not January. And ultimately, they awarded the disputed votes to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in a series of strict party line 8-7 votes. And Hayes was declared the winner. And it averted a truly unprecedented crisis. But I'll close with one final comment. In comparing and thinking about 1876 and 2020, Tilden didn't file lawsuits challenging the outcome in the same way that the Trump campaign did in this past election. But there were actually dozens of state-level lawsuits filed by representatives of both political parties challenging the results and the decisions of these canvassing boards. And after the federal commission decided in favor of Hayes, Tilden's advisors urged him. They said, you should challenge us, challenge the final result through the Supreme Court. And there were scores of white Southerners who were writing to Tilden, and they were swearing to use violence to help challenge the result. And I've actually been thinking about that a lot in the context of what we saw on Wednesday, because what happened on Wednesday is exactly what people in the winter of 1876 and 1877 were afraid of. But Tilden refused, in part because he, like many others, were terrified of reigniting the Civil War. And even though Tilden himself believed he was the rightful winner, he chose not to challenge the results. And that's perhaps the most important difference between 1876 and 2020.
Thank you so much, Erik, and thank you all. So we now have been schooled in the long history of electoral dysfunction, if that's a phrase, in American history. And now I just want to throw it open to all of American history, including, I think we all want to talk about this week, right now, and the 2 weeks remaining, a little bit under 2 weeks, and the possibility of the 25th Amendment being invoked. I have studied one tough transition. Like Rachel, I've worked on 1860, and I lived in one. I was a Clinton staffer, as Gavin mentioned. So I was there in the very weird time of November and December 2000. But this is, I think, well past 2000 in its dysfunction, probably a little shy of 1860. It feels like the second worst ever, but it might be the worst ever. Do any of you want to argue that we are in the worst election in American history?
I'll take a swing.
Let's take a vote.
I mean, very historian-like of me, I was like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the argument for that is partly, I think, it's important to note that it's not as though, and several people have already said this, it's not as though there was never violence in or around the Capitol. It's not as though all elections were happy moments where everyone held hands and then elections happened. Much of what happened here has roots in political behavior and electoral behavior and American politics. What is striking this week is that it was a mass mob attack intending harm of some kind and encouraged by the President of the United States. So in scale and in frame, it kind of is on its own little track. Other things happen, but not quite that extreme. So I think one could argue that because of that, and added to that, the fact that, and I'm sure we can come back to this later, I think that a lot of Americans don't sort of fundamentally understand how democracy really works and what is so bad necessarily about what happened. That's a big problem too, not as though throughout American history, everybody, sort of happily understood all of the subtleties of democracy. But I think right now we're at a particular moment where it would sure be great if people had a better understanding of how our system worked and what a democracy was.
Even though
Ted, I'd like to.
Oh, go ahead, Peter. Yep, sure.
I want to talk a little bit about how bad 1800 was in 1801 in the context of violence and the threat of violence. And what I see in 2020 is a mashup of faux neo-revolutionary theater mapped onto an entirely different system in an entirely different country. And it's that conjunction of evoking the revolutionary generation. But if you go back to our century, the 19th century that we're talking about today, the distinction between political and military mobilization is a very narrow one. I would say that the American Revolution is the first big election that called 1776. People were making the same kinds of choices that they thought they were making in 1800 or in the other contested elections. That is, that the future was at stake. And the idea, I talked about how local politics was, it is face to face. Think about the military or about organized force. Think about militias. Think about the way that people participating in the war. And then one of my favorite things about 1824 and other elections is the way partisans marched to the polls. That idea that this is like a military struggle and that a robust conception of citizenship entails the possible use of arms, because you don't trust union is all important. You've got to survive in a dangerous world, but you don't trust your fellow Americans. And that tension between the need to stay together and that centrifugal impulse is tearing apart, and then the capability, the capacity of local communities to mobilize in ways that they can take over government. This is a different world, but that play acting that we just saw, and some of them were wearing costumes, right? They were reenacting, and it doesn't make it trivial or insignificant. This is a horrible moment in American history. And what it says to me is that we take for granted the continuation and the ongoing story of America. And you can't, because it could fall apart. Well, everybody knew it could fall apart in the early period. I think that's a really critical distinction.
It was amazing how many different historical reenactments were all happening at the same time. I mean, there was definitely neo-Confederate stuff going on, and then Holocaust denial, disgusting. And the guy with the horns, it almost seemed like the sacking of the Roman capital.
There was a guy dressed as George Washington kneeling in front of the Capitol. Yeah.
So one thing I'm thinking a lot about is how poorly enforced our rules often are. And we think we have, the Constitution, we have a clear roadmap and an amendment process that we all understand, but a lot of this is improvised. Erik just told us about the weird commission of 1876 with 5, 5, and 5. Where does that come from? And going back to 1800, there was a fair amount of doubt. Peter can help us, but even as the vote was coming in, which guy on the Jefferson ticket is actually going to be the president? Is it Aaron Burr or Thomas Jefferson? And then it does feel like when John Adams accepted it, I mean, we're now in a moment where a defeated candidate absolutely refuses to concede, and he is still the president, and that's a problem no founder anticipated. So how important was it when Adams actually conceded defeat to Jefferson?
Well, Adams couldn't wait to get out of there. That's why he didn't stay for the inauguration. There was no question of his holding on to the presidency, none at all. You're right, Ted, about the ridiculous failure of the system. It's a stupid constitution. They had two people who had the same number of votes, and the rule was the one with more votes was going to be the president, and they had the same number. And that led to what we have in all of these cases, or the three cases aside from 1860, that wonderful, like Rachel was talking about, that was so clean and straightforward, is we had it thrown into the House where there was improvisation, where the rules were not clear. I think one of the reasons rules don't get clarified is people take things for granted. They think, well, it's going to work. It's going to work. And that's the big wake-up call, I think, right now.
I would just add to that 1860 produced its own version of that, right? Because these states that seceded, the folks who remained in the Union did not want to accept the idea that secession was a legal process. And so trying to figure out how to manage that under the Constitution was extremely tricky. What to do, for example, with the senators and congressmen who had left the Capitol and had not officially resigned their positions, or had resigned in some fashion, but not left in a way that made perfect sense under the rules. So I think all of these elections, but I think in general in the 19th century, there was a lot more experimentation or recognition that you had to experiment with the Constitution, and realization that the Constitution did not have the answers to all of the things that the people needed when it came to elections, when it came to political processes.
Yeah, and building on what Rachel has just said, I mean, it seems to me there's often this assumption that sort of among Americans that you get the founding and you get the Constitution, the rules are all there, and people forget that the 19th century was this period of sort of as Rachel said, experimentation, of kind of working these things out. And, it strikes me that so much of the political history of our country is, as Peter said, taking things for granted and certain sort of norms that are not written down. And when someone violates those norms, as I think we have seen repeatedly in this outgoing administration, we get stuck in these crises where, well, what do we do now? There's no actual written down rule. It's just sort of been assumed people wouldn't do this. And we see this in 1876, 1860, and I think that's a big story, that story of process of what's going on in these 19th century elections.
And I think along with improvisation, there's also something that people either haven't known or dismissed because there's an assumption that the system will keep going and we're immune to the problems of other lesser democracies. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that is not very savory in all of these elections that isn't necessarily apparent at the time and that people now don't necessarily know about, but that would cause people to think and actually realize that never is anything as sure as we think it is, right? That even when things seem perfectly straightforward. So an example of this, I just forgot right where I was going, guys. An example of this, actually, it's 1800. It's a letter that I somehow or other didn't read when I was writing my first book, but found recently. And it's Jefferson writing after the election has been decided, and they're basically saying, well, what would you have done if this happened? Or what would you have done if this happened? And the letter basically says, well, when it got thrown into the House and it became clear that it might not be decided in what felt like a just or right way, we let it be known that if it went the wrong way, if something unjust happened, there would be violence. So, there you have it, 1801, an open statement like that, which, and I'm sure everyone here has lots of examples of all of these things happening behind the scenes, because along with improvisation goes instability.
I mean, were people getting beat up in the 4 elections you helped us to understand? Were there thugs at polls pushing people around, or other just blatant misbehavior in those 4 elections?
That was sort of a feature of 19th century elections more generally. You had folks called shoulder hitters who would come to the polls and would hit people out of line when they were voting. There was violence at the polls all the time. To pick up on something Peter said earlier, there was a newer group in 1860 called the Wide Awakes. It was sort of a militarized group of Republicans who had these massive marches and rallies in favor of Lincoln that really bordered on sort of military demonstrations. So violence was sort of an expected part. And it was part of the process of actually voting, is that you knew that you were going to encounter that. That's a big difference from today. You do not expect to go to the polls and encounter a shoulder hitter, for example.
And I would sort of jump on that and say, yes, it's absolutely correct. It's part of this political culture. Elections were often these kind of social events. There was a lot of alcohol, but it takes on a much more sinister turn after the Civil War. And as I mentioned at the start, when you get the sort of level of violence and voter suppression aimed at preventing Black men from voting in the South, and the sort of the level of racism, and that takes on, I think, an entirely different tone than the kinds of violence that Rachel's talking about, which is also important and existed for sure. So, I mean, short answer, Ted, yes, absolutely. Violence was a regular feature of 19th century elections.
It seems like we're seeing a very specific flaw in the Constitution that we didn't ever anticipate, which is that a first-term president, when defeated, still has a great deal of power to mess up the system, and there's a long transition. Peter mentioned John Adams really wanted to get out of there, and John Quincy Adams, there wouldn't have been a problem with him. But is there any other evidence of a defeated one-term president causing disruption between the election and the next inauguration? I can't think of any. But.
No, I don't think so.
So we're off the known map right now. And given the the growth in executive power over the last 100 years, it's really a very dangerous situation, including, I think it was only last night in the news, Nancy Pelosi has been talking with the Joint Chiefs to constrain Donald Trump's power to start a war or set off nuclear weapons. I mean, the presidency is extraordinarily powerful. And when you have an extremely unhappy losing candidate who is the president, there's a potential for great mischief. So I'm not sure what the remedy will be for this, but I think we, like in 1876 and in our lifetimes, we've seen other moments where we did a deep, like after Watergate, a deep rethink of the checks on the presidency. We may need a new round of constraints. And it felt like when Congress came back late Wednesday night, they were mad, and they're still mad. And it's maybe the beginning of the legislative branch taking some power back after a long period of giving it up to the executive. Do you agree?
I think that would be a great thing, Ted. I mean, what you have in the 19th century, particularly earlier on, but it's not going to be this kind of random violence in which people like the people who attacked the Capitol bring their cell phones and do selfies and take a bus or whatever. You have forms of political organization. You have states. You have institutions. In 1801, the threat of violence would come from mobilization on the state level. And in a way, some of that mobilization takes place at the extremes of constitutional legitimacy. That is, it's unclear what, with a military, for instance, what the role of the militia is. And I think that the big difference, and what I'm encouraged by now, is that I think people are taking citizenship and voting seriously in a way I've never known in my lifetime. And there's been massive alienation and cynicism about the worthlessness of your vote. And a nostalgia, I think it's even reflected in the nostalgia for the revolutionary period when people do play act at being soldiers. What the answer to that is for people who want to uphold order and use the capacities of government to make this a better place, a better world. They now see the possibility of their own civic participation as the answer. That's the real answer. I agree with you, Ted, that we have to address these issues of criminality and of anarchy, and Congress definitely needs a reboot, because it's lost all respect for the American. And these are our representatives, but we don't identify with them. I think the identification of enraged citizens with their voting, with their citizenship, their identification with the system itself is now the powerful and most efficacious antidote to the nonsense that we saw enacted.
But part of the reason for that, I think, is, and probably seems to me it's not really being talked about very much, is that we saw this happen in the sort of seat of democratic governance amidst this sort of, ceremonial process of vote counting. What we saw, all of these things that, again, we kind of take for granted, like, yeah, there's, what happens again with the vote counting? How does that work? Who counts what? How do they, all of these ceremonial things that, were put in place and are followed seemingly without thinking very hard about them. When someone interrupts that, when the Capitol itself is desecrated in that way, there's a power to that. Everyone has been talking about the caning of Charles Sumner, right? Because it's the one violent thing people know happened in Congress. So they're like, oh, in 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner is caned really violently in the Senate by a Southern representative, really violent act. Because it takes place in the Senate on the floor with the senator at his desk, it feels like to Northerners that the South is beating the North into submission. There's a symbolism there and a power, even though they didn't necessarily see it, that I think that's some of what's going on now, and some of what's pulling along the lines of what Peter just said is some of what's causing the anger is about what happened. Some of it is that the guttural punch of it is there, because of the way it happened, because we could see it, and because of the things that, again, we took for granted as being ceremonial, but that actually really matter.
What was your reaction, Joanne, to the photograph of the flag, the Confederate flag with Charles Sumner right behind it in the painting? Wasn't that incredible?
Well, and I believe Calhoun on his
That's
left,
right.
and Sumner on his
Calhoun, I was
right,
gonna
right? Yeah, no, that was, that to me just, you know, there it was. there was, you know, every historian I think was like that is the photo. Remarkable in so many ways. It just was like, you know, this flag that doesn't belong there in any way, literally trapped between history with someone standing there unaware of any of that history. I mean, that feels like one of those, you know, Pulitzer Prize winning, that's a prize winning photo because it captures so much in such an amazing image.
If I can, I just want to add something to that picture because I think, you know, the caning is what we often know about Sumner, but one of the interesting things that happens during the war is that there are questions about members of Congress and senators who are remaining and may have some sympathy with the Confederacy. And in February 1862, the Senate votes to expel Jesse Bright, who's an Indiana senator from the Senate, in part for his relationship to Jefferson Davis. He offers a letter of introduction to a friend of his, to Jefferson Davis. And Sumner is the one who leads the charge on this and says that the Senate should expel traitors. And so I thought a lot about that in terms of the Confederate flag there and what he might have thought of the Confederate flag being waved in front of him. You know, the Senate is not a place for traitors. It must be they must be expelled.
The other thing I thought about too with Sumner is he's out of Congress for a while after the caning. He comes back and he gives this rip-roaring speech about the barbarism of the South. And a big part of that, there's a whole chunk of that speech, which is about barbaric slaveholders in Congress, right? Barbarism happening in the Capitol, violence happening in the Capitol, and how that's such a sign of the South. That's such a sign of precisely what the South is.
Oh, wow.
Again, you know, that photograph contains so much.
Maybe this is, I'm naive, but in the midst of, you know, the national conversation we've had over the last couple of years about Confederate monuments, I couldn't believe there's still a portrait of Calhoun hanging in the Capitol. It was sort of, maybe I wasn't following closely enough. I saw very few comments on the fact that Calhoun is behind that.
That's a very good point, Erik.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Well, I have a counterintuitive question to ask, and I deplored the events of Wednesday. I just want to make that completely clear, but just to be counterintuitive, there is a long tradition in American history, including in Massachusetts with Shays' Rebellion, and in Pennsylvania with the Whiskey Rebellion, of people who are disaffected, or the bonus army under Hoover, who come into Washington and they have grievances, and maybe they're not the most focused grievances, but they feel a right to come in. And Donald Trump has often compared himself to Andrew Jackson. I think that's a stretch, but there is a kind of Jacksonian way of thinking about the US government. It belongs to us. We built it. I mean, is there any historical argument to be made to justify the other side? I'm just trying to be as fair as possible.
I'll be interested to see what others say, but to me, there's a clear distinction. Of course, we have a right to protest. We have a right to put ourselves in Washington. You know, people have a right to have strong disapproval of the government. All of the things you've just described, even if they're called, you know, rebellions or whatever, they represent really strong criticism and protest against the government. What they don't mean and what they don't include is literally attacking an institution of government with the intention of overturning the political process and potentially doing harm. That's not protest anymore.
That's a good answer, Joanne. Yeah,
I would just add to that it's a rejection of democracy, and that's where you can bring in the Civil War, right? Because what it is a rejection of the legitimacy of the people who participated in that election, and therefore saying, okay, now we don't believe anymore in this democratic experiment. And in 1860, that's exactly what happens, right? There's an acceptance that Lincoln won the election, but there is a rejection of what Lincoln stands for and a rejection of the idea of eliminating slavery in the territories, or what many in the South believe, the white Southerners believe that Lincoln is after slavery in their own states, which is not true, but or at least not in the immediate term. But this is a rejection of the democratic process because there's a belief that there's not a legitimate union anymore. And so both of those reject sort of the very foundation of what the United States is meant to be, whether it's really a democracy in a time where Black men and women and white women could not vote. Maybe we have some questions about, but that's what the point is anyway.
Right.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
Go ahead, Peter.
Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I was just going to say the choice that the framers saw and that people feared at the time of Shays' Rebellion was the danger on one hand of anarchy, on the other hand of the total consolidation of authority, what was called universal monarchy, of anticipating Napoleon before his time. That is, either way, liberty is lost. Liberty is in this space, a contested space in which the boundaries of acceptable and legitimate authority are constantly in play. And it's why the Constitution, which is subject to so many varied interpretations, is so important. Nobody knows exactly what it is, and that's probably a good thing. But those elastic boundaries at the edge of legitimate action that is not breaking the law, not violating accepted norms, because there's a cliff you go off. That is the cliff into lawlessness and anarchy. Anarchy is not democracy. That was a clear distinction. In fact, the word democracy itself did not become naturalized and normalized until the 19th century. Jefferson didn't use it much because it wasn't clear that it was possible for ordinary people to participate in their own government. That was the big question. And we're still asking it.
Thank you, Peter. Erik, did you want to jump in too?
Yeah, this is going back to building on what Rachel had said, and Ted, you had mentioned sort of there's a Jacksonian thread here, or a Jacksonian moment, and one of the things we know about Jacksonian democracy is this is built on the idea that this is a republic for white men only. And if we want to draw a through line there, I mean, there's a clear division today between two sides, and Rachel and I wrote about this. One side is very interested in making voting as accessible as possible. The other side is not. And in fact, specifically and surgically targeting particularly groups of color. So I think there is, if we think about what happened on Wednesday, there's a clear relationship to the past in terms of when there are moments of trying to expand democracy or expand who is included in that democracy, there's always been resistance. And I think what we saw on Wednesday is part of that long tradition.
So in about 5 minutes, we'll open it up to the audience and can't wait for their questions. Thinking a little bit about Joe Biden putting together his inaugural address, what does he say? And then how does he govern in a way that begins to heal this nation? I imagine he will try to build bridges out to the Trump supporters. I think that would be appropriate, but how does he do it? And does your study of history offer any concrete examples? Maybe we should go in the same order: Peter, Joanne, Rachel, and Erik.
Well, certainly for Jefferson, the idea that we were all, as you started with that quote from his inaugural address, Ted, he said the right things at the right moment. So here's an argument for the efficacy of rhetoric. He didn't even really mean what he said because he wasn't accepting the legitimacy of Federalists. He used a small f, and he meant those people who would sustain the federal system as well as Republican government. So a little bit disingenuous, but it was understood and taken to be an olive branch. But the most important thing is that Americans found out that the Federalists found out that the worst things that they had expected, predicted, did not happen. And I think right now is an opportunity to enforce the law, to punish criminals, including the criminals who assaulted the Capitol, and to punish some of the people who are involved in precipitating this. I mean, not the opposite in a way. I'm suggesting in a lawful, sober, proper way, people have to be held responsible. And I think he knows that. I'm not preaching anything to him or to anybody that's, I think, not common sense. But a combination of saying the right things and establishing the clear parameters of what acceptable citizenship is, and why we need a robust and engaged citizens. That's really important. And I think I'm just going to be the optimist tonight. I think it's going to happen.
That's great. Thank you, Peter. Joanne?
Well, I guess I'll say two things. I totally agree with what Peter just said. I just think it's important to note that it will be important for the new president to talk about the order of unity and accountability. There has to be accountability before there can be unity. I think there has to be some way of saying actually a line was crossed, not as Peter suggested in a punitive way, but part of what Biden is going to have to do, not in a let's all hold hands and it's all fine now way, but really he's going to have to construct a sense of we, right? Because we really right now are suffering on that count in so many ways. And Americans, we're beyond othering each other, right? I mean, and what just happened is a great example of that, right? The election doesn't count because the people who voted that we don't like, their votes don't matter. They're not Americans. So there needs to be accountability, there needs to be unity, and there needs to be some way. This is why people become president and why I will not ever think about becoming president. Some brilliant person has to come up with the way to make it clear that there can be a we, that there is still a we, that diversity of all kinds in ideas as well as in every other way is part of who we are, and that we failed at some things in the past, but that we can do better.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. Rachel?
I think I'm going to offer sort of a controversial opinion here, and that is maybe to not follow Lincoln's lead. One of the things I think that Lincoln does is he tries very hard to appeal to white Southerners to stay in the Union, to the point of endorsing an original 13th Amendment that would have made slavery legal in the United States forever, supposedly. He endorses it in his inaugural address, and he does try to make this appeal to Southerners. And I think it's something that had been going on for quite some time. In the 1840s and 50s, you have white Southerners repeatedly behaving as though they are victims in the United States, even though they hold an enormous amount of political power. And as a result, it becomes this situation where white Northerners are repeatedly acquiescing in the demands of white Southerners. And Lincoln sort of approaches this, I think, in a more conciliatory manner than maybe was advisable. Maybe, I don't know. It depends on whether you think that the Civil War would have happened regardless. But in this case, I think Lincoln is maybe not our model. He usually is, but he's maybe not our model in 1861. When he was pretty quiet, as you've written about, Ted. He was pretty quiet in the time between his election and when he came to Washington. Although he gave many speeches on the trail to Washington, but he was pretty quiet, and then he was conciliatory in his outward statements. And Joe Biden has behaved quite differently, I think, since what happened on Wednesday. But I think maybe not following Lincoln in this case.
That's really interesting, Rachel. Thank you, Erik.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about. I'm going to talk about a little bit the idea of bipartisanship, because it strikes me that one thing that is a feature and that has upset and people find so perplexing about our current political moment is the lack of bipartisanship. And we constantly see appeals to we need more bipartisanship. And I think, as all of us here are historians of the 19th century, the concept of bipartisanship didn't really exist in the 19th century. And I think what we're living through now is not new in the long sort of arc of American history. And the problem, and I'm going to be the pessimist to Peter's optimism. At first I was very encouraged on Wednesday, and I stayed up late like many others watching all of the counting of the votes. And I don't know how many saw we'd come through this moment, this attempted insurrection, this riot in the Capitol. And at first it was encouraging that you had all of these senators who had pledged to protest the votes and then withdrew those pledges at the last minute. But there was this moment on the House floor during the final couple of hours of debate, very, very late on Wednesday night, where the Democrat Connor Lamb was giving a fiery address, and nearly a fight broke out. And I thought, really at this moment, we've just gone through this and you still have this kind of guttural disagreement. And that really I found discouraging. So, I mean, if we're going to appeal to bipartisanship, first of all, we have to have a simple set of facts that we all agree on, which doesn't seem to be the case right now. And I think that's kind of the challenge of, if we're going to talk about what the challenges for Biden is, and I would agree with Rachel, I don't think we should be conciliatory. And as Peter said, we need to make sure that people are held accountable. And the idea of bipartisanship, I think, actually gets in the way of that.
Thanks so much, Erik. Thank you all. So I have a question now from the audience, and I hope they will keep coming in. It's from Carlos. And it's for anyone. Once there was public global knowledge of the attack, we had various world leaders make public statements about America's democracy. For example, Emmanuel Macron's "What happened today in Washington, D.C. is not America." So in that light, I would like to ask the panel about the external perceptions of hotly disputed United States presidential elections in a historical context. Was there a sympathetic view of the American system of governance? Does anyone want to take that one? So foreign perceptions of our electoral troubles.
I'll say very briefly, foreign observers were amazed that we didn't fall apart instantly. That's the kind of the baseline. And the fact that somehow this ungainly system that didn't have the conventional fiscal military state on the top and a tradition of submission to authority, hierarchy, that it could function, it dazzled some of Tocqueville's the most famous. Mm-hmm. This thing works. In fact, he was probably a little bit besotted by it because he didn't see the Civil War coming right away, and it did, and that was disillusioning. But yes, the fact that you could have a strong popular participation, mobilization, and that you could sustain governance, that amazed the enlightened world.
But I think then, so Americans always thought, we are spreading the light of liberty and we are spreading democracy, and that dates all the way back. And at some point, some people around the world did look at what was happening here and think, wow, like that's something different. And then we're disillusioned. Yes. A great example of that is Charles Dickens, who comes to the United States in the 1840s. And he's one of these people who's like, wow, democracy. And he's very interested to come. And he comes here and then leaves entirely disillusioned because it's just the United States is not what he thought it would be. The South is horrendous. Whatever he saw of slavery was horrible. Tobacco spitting everywhere he looked. He goes and he leaves just thinking, whatever I thought was there, it's not there. I don't know what is there, but it's not there. So I do think I do think people compare with the United States because the United States so often sets itself forward as an example. And in a way, that's sort of, we're seeing some of that now. I'm sure we're going to continue to see that in ways both good and bad in weeks and months to come.
I think you saw that a lot in the Civil War too. Lincoln famously calls the United States the last best hope of Earth. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I think echoes, particularly in Europe during this period. There's a division over whether to support the Confederacy, but there is a degree of support for the idea that the United States is this beacon of democracy and that this is a huge moment in the history of democracy during the Civil War. again, in part because the United States talks about it in this way, it becomes part of the conversation around the world.
And this turning the question kind of upside down a little bit, Americans are also extraordinarily self-conscious, particularly during the Civil War, of the idea that their democracy might fail and that the rest of the world will be laughing at us because they had Europe and other parts of the world had been so skeptical, and so I think it's something that's very much on Americans' minds as well as the rest of the world.
So thank you all. We have a new question from Jerry. Some people have suggested using the 14th Amendment, Section 3, barring from federal office officials who have engaged in insurrection or given aid or comfort to those who have against Donald Trump, rather than impeachment or the 25th Amendment. Are there precedents for this, and what were the outcomes? I can't think of any, but perhaps some of you.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, what's interesting about the 14th Amendment is so enormously important in terms of constitutional history and the Due Process Clause and such a wide range of different areas of constitutional law. But there's these other sections of the 14th Amendment that people always forget about. It's sort of, you have that first section, which everyone who's familiar with the 14th Amendment knows, but then if you read the rest of it, it seems kind of crazy. And it's because most of that was put in there to effectively either punish or limit the political power of white Confederates after the Civil War. And so that's where that Section 3 comes from. Whether it's been used outside of that context, I couldn't say, honestly. I'm not sure if anyone else on the panel knows.
Well, certainly not for a president.
No.
I mean, Donald Trump has been pushing his Confederate heritage, which ironically he doesn't even have, a long time. And this might be his, might finally get what he wants. He will be prosecuted
as a Confederate.
As a Confederate, yeah. From Serena, I'd love to hear Peter elaborate on his idea that political violence is at the edge of constitutionality, but maybe not off the edge.
Well, things can blow up. I think the 1790s models the constitutionalism at the heart of polarization among Americans. It's not that anybody was against the Constitution. It was just how you read it and how you interpreted it. There's no Constitution if we start making war on each other. That's true. But there are positions you can take about, for instance, the role of the states. That's, of course, the big constitutional issue in the Civil War as well. What sorts of authorities can be exercised in the levels of government that are more responsive to and directly govern the people. So I just want to point to the central significance of violence to everything. I'm not for violence, don't get me wrong. It's best to have it organized and for there to be rule bound. And I think probably the most important principle in American history has been evoked recently, and that is civilian supremacy. We have to insist on civilian supremacy over the military so that the military doesn't move beyond its proper ambit of authority. And that's crucially important. And on the level of the individual citizenship and what it entails, we admire and soldiers, men and women who give their lives for their country, but it's for their country. It's Joanne's we we're talking about here. And that means a submission to your own authority. So I'm just saying that violence is all around, and and I would even argue that the end of slavery is impossible without violence. And so it's in fact, there's no moment in which there's any serious movement anywhere in the world against slavery without a war going on. So we should be aware of how close we always are to going over that edge. Mm-hmm. Again, this is theater that we're looking at this one. It's just not going anywhere. But it does evoke that sense of how near we are to the edge of the abyss. And I think that's a great wake-up call.
Thank you, Peter. Here's a question about theater. It's from Carla. Thanks to the panelists. I was struck on Wednesday by the iconography of the mob members carrying Crusaders flags. Would anyone on the panel want to comment on the role of religion in 19th century elections? Presumably anti-Catholicism, I'm assuming.
I mean, it's certainly in 1876, it's a big part of the campaign. And it's something that you see throughout the middle period of the 19th century, this level of nativism, frankly, bigotry and anti-Catholicism. It's something that is central to the Republican and Rutherford B. Hayes's platform and campaign in 1876. So I don't think that's quite the same as the iconography of the Crusades, but it certainly was part of the campaigns.
You know, the power of that symbolism and iconography and what it represents is part of why it gets, you know, trapped into partisan politics. And the best statement of that I can think of is a letter by Alexander Hamilton, I think in 1802, maybe, after his party loses the election of 1800, and he's trying to figure out what to do so that things will work better next time. And he looks at the fact that the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, were very passionate about the French Revolution. They were fervent about it. Their emotions were caught up in it. And he says, you know what can do that for us? Religion. It's like, let's create Christian constitutional societies. That'll work really well.
Wow.
So that's the most pragmatic statement about the recognized power that religion can have in a cynical kind of a way, even in popular politics.
I think there's another dimension to it, and that is if you look at religious revivalism, the mobilization of Christian America as a template for collective action, with a scary dimension of it, of course, is the faith commitment, the conversion to being a new person. Means you're taking your signals from beyond, from a transcendent source, from your faith in your God, and that's on the border of civic life. That's moving into another realm, and that's very dangerous. But that's where you get people moving and into action, and we neglect it at our peril. This is not a blanket condemnation of all religious revivals, religion generally, certainly, but there are conflicting moral, ethical schemes at play, and that's the most persistent source of popular grassroots mobilization, I think, throughout American history and revival.
There's a very interesting article in the Boston Globe today, online anyway, by someone who was embedded in a white supremacist group and talked about the language they speak in private to each other. And they love the word crusaders. They believe that white men are almost biologically determined in their thinking to be crusaders and conquerors. And crusaders, it's a negative sounding word in most of the academic world that we all work in. And Osama bin Laden famously called Americans crusaders, but there are some people out there who still want to be crusaders.
Well, I mean, if we want to talk about religion and revivalism and militarization, I mean, the abolitionist movement, that's a part of the abolitionist movement before the Civil War. I mean, you know, John Brown is the most famous and classic example, but religion is absolutely central there, and this kind of iconography of and idea of sort of being God's army towards a greater cause, that's central to the part of the abolitionist movement.
Here's a question from Tom. Did any of these previous contested elections have the feature of the cult of personality like the Trump supporters of today? Their attempt to take down the US flag and replace it with the Trump flag is an example to me of this cult of personality over loyalty to party or nation.
I think the answer to that is no. Jackson is who comes closest. And certainly there was a a degree of cult of personality around Jackson, but Jackson is the head of the Democratic Party, and it's very much about the Democratic Party when Jackson is running. But I think that goes back to something that you said a bit earlier, Ted, about, you know, what was the role of the president in the 19th century? And when you think about a presidency that is much less powerful and much less sort of the focus, when you have Congress that is much more representative, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about here is that Congress was expanding in this period, right, with every census, and Congress has not expanded since 1911. We have a set number, and I think, you know, something like 1,500 members of Congress were we to match it up with the rate of growth from the 19th century. So people cared a lot more about their congressmen, and they cared a lot more about their political machines. And so the cult of personality just didn't operate the same way, even though you did have certain political figures take on important significance. And one last thing is that many of these presidents in the 19th century did not campaign themselves. Right. So the parties are campaigning on their behalf. They're not really making a lot of speeches, and they're not going out sort of promoting themselves.
It's funny how Donald Trump, who anyone who has ever met him, I have not, but I know some historians who have, say he has an astonishingly small knowledge of American history, and apparently has almost never read a book, but he has this, you know, intuitive intelligence. There is something there, and he understood that Andrew Jackson was his guy. And I wonder if you would even ask him one accomplishment of Andrew Jackson, what he would come up with. But he understood what you began by saying is Jackson comes closest to the cult of personality, and he knew that that existed and that was attractive to him.
But I think, I mean, who the heck knows? But if you're going to know something about Jackson, what you're probably going to know, you might know that there's the genocide of Native Americans, but on a more superficial level, you know that he's this raging, wild, angry guy, right? Who like broke rules and did things his own way, and people loved when he did that. And to me, I assumed that was the very superficial way in which there was some kind of a connection.
Yeah, that's right, Joanne.
I would point out two big differences from Jackson, and one is that, you know, when under pressure, Jackson is in favor of keeping the Union together during the nullification crisis in 1833, and the second is that Jackson was actually in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College. Even though he was in favor of white democracy, white male democracy, he was in favor of more white male democracy than many of his predecessors. And in his first inaugural address, first message to Congress, I should say, he says, you know, we should get rid of the Electoral College. It is not a fair way of electing a president.
I'm not in favor of dueling in spite of liking Joanne's work, but can you imagine a duel between Jackson and Trump? Trump would still be running. So on Electoral College, which you just mentioned, from Mary Catherine, using a historical lens, do any of you think we should rethink the idea of the Electoral College and abolish it? We have a lot of, okay, that's it. Tough one.
I don't think that's tough at all. I do think we should get rid of the Electoral College. I think one of the things that's really hard is now, especially in the 21st century, and we've touched on this a little bit, is thinking about the Constitution creatively and about constitutional change. And there were lots of attempts to think about the Constitution creatively in the 19th century. And there were many people who opposed the Electoral College in the 19th century and the 20th century. There were many efforts to get rid of the Electoral College in the 20th century. Just because it is doesn't mean it has to exist. Now, whether we can have the political will to eliminate it, that's another thing, but it has become something that does not match up with what the political system should look like. And so personally, I think we should get rid of it. And I don't think there should be much of a question about it.
I would agree, and I would add too that we desperately need to revise the Electoral Count Act of 1887 that I learned a lot more about this year than I knew before. And if you stayed up, as I said, if you stayed up late Wednesday night and watched that process unfold, it was because of that law, which by all accounts is horribly convoluted and confusing and contradictory. And that's along with the Electoral College, what actually governs this process. I'm hoping with a unified Congress and White House, there might be actually some political will to do something about that.
I'm not going to disagree with my distinguished, much younger colleagues, but I will say that opposition to the Electoral College and the sense that our votes are at risk, the fears of fraud and suppression of voting, this is energizing voters all over the country. It's something that we need to deal with. But the real end is not just to come up with a system in which Democrats will win because there are more of us. Instead, we need to sustain engaged citizenship. And right now, I'm not going to make an argument for the states as such. I will make an argument for political action and the capacity of local government and state, counties and states. Because to sustain civic engagement over the long haul, we have to believe that citizenship and voting matters. And we do now. And one of the reasons we do is because the Electoral College denied or put bad administrations in office. Well, you can do something about that now. Yeah, maybe you change the Electoral College, but what we need are engaged citizens.
Totally agree, Peter. I spent most of my life supporting the Electoral College because I'm from a very the smallest state. And it was a privilege, if you're from Rhode Island, to have 2 senators, 2 congressmen. We're about to lose a congressman, but 4 electors. So basically overrepresented. And there are a lot of small states I like. I lived in Maryland once. It's a great state. I've lived in Massachusetts.
Vermont is wonderful.
Yeah. But I just feel that the damage of, in the election of 2016 and the election of 2000, and I don't mean to be too political, but the damage was so severe to the country each time that I do think we need to go to move beyond it. So I'm changing my mind.
But what's interesting about that is I think I love what Rachel said about thinking creatively about the Constitution. I actually think these disaster elections encourage that. Right, that people are willing to think that way. There was a show that was on Broadway called "What the Constitution Means to Me," and part of that show involves polling the audience, asking them to vote on whether they think we should redo the Constitution. And according to the woman who stars in that show, the audience always wants to redo the Constitution. The audience always votes. Now, what's interesting to me, and I will confess this, is sitting in the audience as a historian, they're like, we should just redo the Constitution. And I found myself gripping the arms of my chair. I was like, wait. But I do think disaster and problems are people are willingly thinking and realizing precisely what Rachel said.
So we have 1 or 2 more questions. I'll await instructions, but this is from Laura. I am wondering if the manipulation and condemnation of the press that we've seen from 2016 to now was a feature of the other contested elections that you all write about.
I'll say yes and no. There are some parallels. I mean, the way that in the 19th century, you had newspapers, and that was effectively it. And in many, I would say even most towns, you had 2 newspapers, 1 for each political party. And so this idea that people lived in kind of their own little political bubbles, where they only read news coming from their party, was a reality. I mean, there were these echo chambers in the 19th century that you can say are somewhat analogous to now. I think, though, that the degree to which, to the question, was the media manipulating the outcomes, I don't think it compares even remotely to sort of what we're experiencing now with social media, 24-hour news cycles, and all of that.
But I want to actually touch on social media, because I do think, although it's not formally the press, there was a 19th century pseudo equivalent that touches on, or certainly highlights, how much technology can change democracy, right? So in the late 1840s and in the 1850s, what you have is the telegraph. Mm-hmm. And what the telegraph does is suddenly things happening at Washington spread around the country very quickly, more widespread than ever before, combined with the railroad and steam-powered printing presses. So the telegraph becomes this, it sort of takes the spin away from the people who are used to controlling it and affects the conversation of politics. And I think that that's precisely where we are right now, is that social media makes everything so immediate and so atomized in a way, and so hard to control, and so fundamentally, particularly with a president who tweets, it has complicated the conversation of politics to an extent that we're going to have to uncomplicate it a little bit now, which we're seeing now with Twitter, deciding who should or shouldn't be allowed on their platform. That's the beginning of a process of trying to figure out how this should work.
That was the last question. Do any of you want to give concluding remarks, things you wanted to say earlier in the session, or a question that was not asked? If not, I just want to give the deepest thanks to Peter, Onuf, Joanne, Freeman, Rachel, Shelden, and Erik Alexander. This was not only illuminating, it was really comforting. It was comforting to put the crazy events of this week in context. And I want to thank MHS staff, but I really want to thank the audience. We have 443 people still on after 90 minutes of hardcore history. And it just once again reminds me that if you love history, do not mess with Massachusetts, because people take it very seriously. So thank you for your interest. Thank you for hanging in there with us. Thank you for the great panelists. And let's all stay closely tuned to events over the next 11 days, I think it is.
Yep.
Thank you all. This was wonderful. We like to think of the Historical Society as a place where intelligent conversation and useful conversation can happen. And that's certainly what happened today. Thank you.
And I just thank everyone as well for joining us, and also thank those of you who have joined us on Facebook. So we are not just broadcasting to 500 people on Zoom, but also to a host of people on Facebook. So thank you for joining us. And it's been a wonderful program. I would just put a plug in for one of our fellow institutions. If a topic that you wanted to hear about wasn't covered on this, our friends at Revolutionary Spaces are hosting a very similar program on Wednesday. So you can join them and maybe you can catch another piece that wasn't included here. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and I hope you will remember that MHS hosts these online programs, but we do this all for free. But we do hope that you will support the institution by becoming a member or supporting our mission through a donation. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.